Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on today's Intersection webinar. I'm James Michalowski from the Hunt Institute, and we're very happy to be joined by three of our partners and friends in the philanthropic higher education space this morning. Before I introduce them, I'm going to turn things over to the Hunt Institute's president and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, who's going to welcome you all and give some framing for our conversation. Over to you, Javed.
Thanks, James. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I have the good fortune of serving as the president of the Hunt Institute. Our team has been working hard to support our networks of policymakers and practitioners by producing a number of resources to inform responses to COVID-19 pandemic across the entire education continuum. We're so grateful to have three of our higher education partners join us today to share what they're hearing from the field and from their grantees. We're especially excited to hear from these three because of their unique perspectives. Philanthropy, or philanthropic organizations, they play a critical role in higher education space, serving as key partners to organizations that drive change in higher education policy at the state, local, and even the institutional levels. So I have no doubt that you will leave this conversation with a clear-eyed picture of the upcoming challenges facing higher ed, but also a little hope for the future. So with that, I'll pass it back to James to facilitate today's conversation. James.
Great. Thank you, Javed. So I'd like to let our guests today say a little bit about themselves, and I'll just mention who we have joining us. We're very happy to have Scott Jenkins from Lumina Foundation, Caroline Altman-Smith from the Kresge Foundation, and Angela Sanchez from Ecmc Foundation. I want to mention that we've saved some time at the back end of this webinar for audience Q&A. If you have questions, we ask that you submit them using the Q&A feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Please note that we are not going to unmute audio lines, so if you do have a question, please submit it through that Q&A feature. So now to the panelists. I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves, and I'm also hoping that you can give some high-level thoughts about how your own work has been affected in the wake of this pandemic. We are going to start with Scott, and then we'll go to Caroline, and then we'll go to Angela. So Scott, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, James. And thanks to Javed and the Hunt Institute for pulling us all together for this session. I'm really excited to be part of it. My name is Scott Jenkins, and I direct our state policy work at Lumina Foundation. And at Lumina, our mission we feel is urgent and affects everyone. We're dedicated solely to ensuring people get education and training after high school, the kind of learning that's essential for each of us as individuals and for the nation. Most of you all may know us through our work through Goal 2025, where 60% of working age people in the United States must have a college degree, certificate, industry certification, or other credential of value beyond high school. And reaching that 60% goal will not be easy. We're at this point, less than half Americans have some education beyond high school, and our current system is out of step with our needs, and the system too often fails to serve people of color and people from low-income households. So we're working to revitalize education to be affordable, student-centered, accessible, and to produce results, especially among African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. And my colleagues at Lumina and I feel strongly that there's no higher mission than this, helping Americans learn and live their best lives. And as I said at the start, this mission has never been more urgent. Operationally at the Lumina Foundation, like most of you all, we have been moved to remote operations for a foundation that focuses on in-person convening, similar to the Hunt Institute. This has made some really interesting challenges to learn how to operate more on Zoom and virtual meetings and things like that. And similar to all of you all, we're struggling to continue to do our work while we're surrounded by, in a lot of cases, educating our children from home and working remotely and shopping once a month and those sorts of things. But we all sit back and think how incredibly blessed we are to work in organizations where we can do this while still doing our mission. Secondly, the work that we've done. We established very early on a contingency fund for our grantees and for our partners that they could tap if they were in cash flow straits that were emergency driven, and provide them some quick release resources so that they could support some of their operations through this period of time. Additionally, we've worked with our grantees and partners and state leadership to look at the grants that we made prior to the pandemic and step back and say, okay, is this the right mission? Is this the right scope of work to be focused on? And being very flexible with them to meet the needs of states and institutions, policy and practice through flexible change. We really have kind of focused on the idea both in how we're doing our work in states and working with our partners over the next immediate future, that we're going to focus on compassion over compliance. We encourage people to do that, both with our grantees, both with the work they're doing, and being flexible with state partners who right now are focused exclusively on pandemic response and those sorts of things. So James, again, thanks for letting Lumina participate in this session.
Of course, thanks very much, Scott. Caroline, over to you.
Great, thank you, James and Javaid, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for having us here today. It's a pleasure to be out with all of you, and we just really appreciate the work that the Hunt Institute does as a great public service, helping policymakers engage and learn more about various stages in the education pipeline and how policymakers can be supportive to the goals that we all share. I want to thank everybody for being willing to do yet another Zoom webinar. I know everyone is sick and tired of interacting via video, but that's the name of the game right now. So thanks for your patience with this format. And also want to wish you a happy college signing day. I'm wearing my University of Virginia t-shirt today in solidarity with the graduating class of 2020. So congrats to all the high school grads out there. And I know that all of us are obviously, as a big part of our day jobs, trying to think through how we and the organizations that we represent can be most helpful to those graduating high school seniors who are entering a very strange new world of post-secondary experiences. On the Kresge front, we are based here in Detroit. We have a mission of expanding opportunities for low-income people in America's cities. Within our education work, we focus very similarly to Lumina on increasing college access and success for low-income and students of color. We do that through three primary strategies. The first is what we call aligning and strengthening urban higher education ecosystems. So within cities, trying to get different city systems that may not have traditionally seen themselves as part of student success efforts to realize that they all have a role to play in helping more people in cities earn college degrees. So childcare, public transit, food and housing insecurity issues. All of these issues that we know can really be barriers to students in completing their education, and engaging business and philanthropy and government to coordinate efforts to support students. The second area that we work in is around strengthening the capacity of institutions that have a special mission to serve low-income and students of color. So we do a lot of work with community colleges as well as minority serving institutions around the country, helping make sure that they have the resources they need and are using evidence-based practices to help more students on their campuses complete degrees. And then our third area is urban pathways to college. And even though many foundations, I think quite admirably, have focused increasingly over the past few years on a student success agenda, we really want to underscore that we can't be complacent about college access issues. And especially when you look earlier in the K through 12 pipeline, there are increasing numbers of Black and brown students. They're more likely to be low income. They are also going to really be in need of intensive supports to navigate what we all know is not an intuitive journey into and through higher ed. So really wanting to make sure that students have the direct access, supports, and services they need to enter and be successful in college. Just a couple quick notes about how things have changed for us since the beginning of the pandemic. As Scott said too, we're all, welcome to my guest room. We're all working from home. We have signed, joining on with almost 800 other foundations, we've signed the Council on Foundations COVID Pledge, which has specified a few things that foundations are committing to, trying to look for ways to release project support restrictions to make support more flexible for grantees in rapidly changing times, suspending reporting requirements, knowing that a lot of organizations don't have the bandwidth to spend a lot of time in reporting right now. We're surveying our grantees, very eager to hear from them about what they're seeing on the ground in ways that can hopefully help inform our own responses. And in general, although we have not been able to increase our payout this year, obviously trying to be as creative and resourceful as we can with the dollars that we have in what is a rapidly changing circumstance. So I guess I would just mention, as everyone knows, philanthropic dollars are completely dwarfed by federal and state dollars. We really have very modest budgets at the end of the day. So a big part of our job is trying to figure out a little bit of a wait and see to see how the federal funds play out, and then to figure out where can we plug in and be strategic and help leverage additional resources towards our shared goals. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Caroline. Angela, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Javed. Good morning. Angela Sanchez, Program Officer for College Success at Ecmc Foundation. And while we do not directly fund the Hunt Institute, I will say that we are very appreciative of this opportunity to be on a panel with our colleagues and also share how we're responding to this crisis right now. So just a quick overview of Ecmc Foundation. Our mission is to inspire and to facilitate improvements that affect educational outcomes, especially among underserved populations, through evidence-based innovation. And the way that we go about carrying that out is, well, one, we're a national post-secondary funder. We're based in downtown Los Angeles, California, usually when we're not working from home. And to that end, we also don't have a geographic focus. So what we do is that we work out of two primary focus areas. On one side is career readiness, which focuses on returning adult learners. So think about ages 27 and up, individuals who have a high school degree or equivalent and are looking for their next short-term degree or credential in order to advance their own skill set and ultimately achieve a family-sustaining wage. On the flip side is a focus area that I work on, which is college success. So college success is geared more toward bachelor degree attainment. So rather than a short-term degree or credential, we're going for that full 4 to usually 6-year BA. And we give in two primary levers. One side are direct service programs. So this can be a coach, a nudge app, any resource that a student engages with directly that overall increases their likelihood of persistence and degree completion. The other side of that is systemic change. So think about more, how can we support policy reform? What are the types of engagements across institutions, whether that's collaborations between 2-year and 4-year institutions, collaborations of 4-year institutions, or something else provided by a third-party organization such as the University Innovation Alliance or Complete College America. All these are types of partners that we have worked with. And in terms of responding to COVID-19, I do definitely agree with what Scott and Caroline have highlighted earlier, compassion over compliance. Right now, we are doing our best to be flexible and responsive to our grantees' needs. So this can include extending reporting deadlines, allowing our grantees to reallocate a portion of their annual grant award without having to go through Ecmc Foundation's formal modification process. We have also, earlier this month, we're in May now, earlier last month in April, we launched a rapid response small grants program where we were able to award up to $10,000 for grantees who applied for general operating support and mitigating the impact of COVID-19 as quickly as possible. Through this program, we were able to reach up to 65 of our grantees, and that's over $580,000 that were awarded to these organizations, which actively serve over 4 million students annually. In addition to that, Ecmc Foundation also provided $1.5 million in emergency aid directly to students. We got this out through multiple channels. $500,000 went to Believe in Students, which partnered with the Equity app. This is an app that works with institutions and college districts to allow them to streamline getting emergency financial aid dollars out to students within 48 hours. Another $500,000 went to the California College Student Emergency Aid Response Fund, which was headed up by College Futures Foundation, a California state funder, as well as Mission Asset Fund, which was able to award up to $500 grants to over 4,300 current California college students. Another $250,000 went out to the University Innovation Alliance, which is a national collaboration of 11 public land-grant universities. And finally, $250,000 went to Ecmc Foundation's affiliate Ecmc, which works with helping minority serving institutions improve student success and institutional outcomes for their students. So right now we recognize that students need access to immediate and flexible dollars. This, the pandemic will definitely affect the rest of our 2020 grant making. And right now our focus is very much on implementing solutions and making sure that we can be as responsive as possible.
Great. Thank you all for those very helpful opening thoughts. I have a couple questions for our guests today, and then we're going to transition to the audience Q&A. As a reminder to the audience, please submit questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Scott, the first question is coming your way. You mentioned in your introduction Lumina's work around making progress towards post-secondary attainment goals. I think we know that those efforts really depend on a number of foundational financial issues and policies at the state level, things like funding structures for institutions and also the availability of aid for low-income students. As some of those things become a little bit uncertain in the wake of this pandemic, can you talk a little bit about what you're hearing from state leaders as they think about responding to some of those fundamental financial challenges?
Sure, James. Thanks for the question. As you indicated, the future of state support for higher education is in question. It's not, I think there's really no clear answers at this point, other than we know that the pandemic and the necessary shutting down of state economies will cause a financial reckoning that will leave state budgets emaciated. Regardless of what we see in the next tranche of federal support, the resources will be severely constrained. For example, Michigan recently spent approximately $250 million on PPE. That represents that amount of funding, which was unbudgeted for 6 months ago, represents the same amount of money that the state typically spends to provide counties with revenue sharing to support essential services. In Illinois, unemployment claims are 7 times what they were at the height of the Great Recession. So when we use the term unprecedented, I think we all need to be honest that it is unprecedented, and we're really going into an era that we need to be much more circumspect about prognosticating what the future looks like, but preparing for the future. We based at Lumina our state policy agenda, the 2017 to 2020 state policy agenda, really under the philosophy that states were not going to provide significant increases in funding to higher education. And that has proven helpful in that it forced us to work to encourage states to look at how they do their funding formulas, to focus more on supporting student populations that have typically been underserved, and providing resources to support the education and training of those students. Also to increase, where possible, the ability of students to provide tuition reimbursement or tuition support through scholarships and grants and those types of need-based aid programs. And additionally, providing kind of non-tuition support beyond that cost, beyond just that tuition cost. And so as we look forward to our work, most of our state policy agenda work has been put on pause. And in the past, where we had a funnel that on the narrow end, we pushed a few key environmental or ecosystem issues out to states around adopting a goal, having good data systems, having a good funding formula that supported outcomes, having an affordability conversation that supported low-income students and students of color. That funnel has been really reversed, and where we're really trying to receive information in from our state higher education leaders, our institutional leaders, governors' budget offices, governors' shops, to see really how they're addressing these issues, so that we can inform our leadership at Lumina, and then also inform the field on what steps states are taking to address this in the near term. most everything we frame is with the last words being during a time of a global pandemic. You know, how do you do a funding formula that supports low-income students, that supports students of color during a time of a global pandemic? And that's going to really change how we think about things. Higher education is 8 to 12% of state budgets. In the future, this could be cut in half. What would that look like? We do know that K-12 will be protected as a budget for as long as possible. Higher education will probably not be protected. So we're framing up an argument that an emergency horizontal budget could be created that focuses on talent, and a talent budget in states that would be student-centered across agencies to make the argument that post-secondary education can serve as the nexus for talent development in a state. We continue to make that argument. This would mean that multiple agencies, similar to what Indiana has done with the governor's workforce cabinet and their WIOA combined plan, work in coordination to formalize that talent is not the sole purview of higher education, but that housing is a talent issue, healthcare is a talent issue, human services is a talent issue, economic development, transportation, corrections, et cetera, all are talent issues and should be budgeted as such at the state level, especially during this emergency time. And the urgency for building interagency support for higher education as the indispensable state talent development system will never be greater than it is now. What we really learned and what we're hearing from our colleagues across the country is that if we don't stick together as higher education and the entities that provide the necessary and needed services to our most at-risk citizens and residents within our states, if we do not stick together, we will surely die alone when the recession comes through.
Thanks, Scott. That's very helpful. Sobering words, but important for us all to keep in mind. Next question that I have is for Caroline. Caroline, I know that a lot of the work that you do involves partnerships with kind of a variety of stakeholders in different urban higher education ecosystems, especially in your home city of Detroit. So I'm wondering, through your conversations with sort of those multiple stakeholders, what have you heard about how different entities might be collaborating or coordinating some of their policy responses to this pandemic?
Great, thank you. And I would like to just add an amen to Scott's framing around talent being obviously an imperative statewide that touches every element of a state and its policy, ideally, and not just segregated as a higher ed conversation. So as I mentioned in the intro, one of our core strategies at Kresge is around the notion of urban higher education ecosystems, and this notion that within a environment with all these different players, everyone has a role to play in improving the attainment rate of the population, no matter what sector they may be coming from. So for us, I think it's been very exciting to see so many colleges on the higher ed side stepping up and really leaning into their public serving mission and serving in ways that don't necessarily have to do with degree production right now, whether that's donating PPE, opening up dining facilities to serve food, kind of emergency training programs, being testing sites for coronavirus, all these different ways that universities have been showing up, I think has been very heartening. We've also seen the doors opening for a number of colleges, especially community colleges that have already spent time and energy building relationships with human service organizations in their communities, or have even opened food banks on their own campuses, and colleges that have been thinking more expansively about student needs holistically, I think are really well positioned to step up during this time as well. I would mention just a couple of collaborations that we've seen here in Detroit that I've found particularly inspiring. As I also mentioned earlier, this notion of what kind of world high school seniors are graduating into is very troubling. I think it's very worrisome. Summer melt, even in a regular year, can affect 1 in 5 college students. This year, it could just be a summer melt tsunami. And so feeling a real sense of responsibility that we don't have a lost generation of high school seniors whose educational plans are completely derailed. And so seeing collaborations in Detroit with entities like the Detroit College Access Network, partnering with Get Schooled, which is a digital platform that provides advising services to students all over the country to make sure that Detroit students are getting help with financial aid, filing changes of status with their FAFSA, basically helping them over the finish line with those last steps that they otherwise would have been able to rely ideally on in-person school guidance counselors. The Michigan College Access Network, here in our state, which is a fabulous partner. They're doing lots of webinar programming with school guidance counselors about how to transition services into a remote environment. They're providing, starting on Monday, a free hotline for high school seniors around the state who need college advising help, who can get near-peer advising support through the Advise Michigan program. And we're also seeing greater degrees of collaboration with the Detroit Chamber, which houses the Detroit Drives Degrees cross-sector kind of collective impact table, working more intensively with the Detroit College Access Network. That's been exciting to see because, as we all know, especially for many policymakers, social justice may not be the most resonant angle of argument of why it's so important to invest in higher ed. One of the reasons I like working in this field is I think there are so many ways into this conversation, so many reasons this is a compelling area to work on. And that can look very different for employers, for policymakers, folks more focused on the ROI of this work. And so having the chamber at the table, partnering with the Detroit College Access Network to make the economic argument of why continued investment is important, is really useful. And they're launching a number of new programs, including one called Detroit Reconnect, to help adults with some college, no degree, or adults who are interested in going to college for the first time to get the supports and advising that they need. So it's great to see folks within, these are just some examples from within one city, and I know these kind of examples are happening around the country, but to see folks rallying to work in new ways, to be very clear about the comparative advantage that they bring to the table, more willing to be flexible in how they join forces. I think in the midst of a horrible crisis where most of us are all stuck at home, very easy to hunker down and just think about your own organization and your own needs. And so to have these examples of folks really being able to pick their heads up, rally around what is a true emergency situation for many of our students' college plans, and figure out how to step into that breach and be helpful has been very inspiring.
Thanks, Caroline. Definitely some encouraging nuggets in there that we can take some measure of hope from. Angela, I'd like to ask you kind of a multi-part question. I know that you work a lot with organizations that provide some direct support to students, and you mentioned a little bit of your recent work in your introduction, but I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit more about the ways in which you've heard that this pandemic has had real concrete effects on the lives of students, whether there are some particularly encouraging solutions being developed in terms of how to support students during this time. The last part is I'm also hoping you can touch on the scope of the solutions that are currently being worked on and how it compares to the overall scope of student need that's out there at this time.
Oh, I get the fun question. So this whole pandemic has been extremely disruptive to our students who are matriculating to college, as well as those who plan on continuing to college. I share Caroline's expressed concern that this will likely be one of the biggest shakeouts of our most vulnerable student populations that we've ever seen. Right now, according to a recently released survey from the Strata Education Network, about 28 million Americans have altogether canceled their education plans. In addition to that, we see that enrollment is expected to drop nationally by about 20%. And in terms of high school seniors completing the FAFSA, we're seeing about 50,000 fewer filings this year compared to this time last year. So students really need to have not only just additional supports, but also guidance on the day-to-day. There's an extreme concern of, I don't know what college will look like in not just 4 to 5 months, but also what does my immediate future look like? This is all keenly felt by our students who come from low-income backgrounds, by our students who may instead now become essential earners for their families. And if we are hoping to continuing safeguarding higher education as one of the few remaining pathways for socioeconomic mobility, this is a humongous blow to so many of our students who saw it as that pathway. It's being also increasingly felt by our students of color. 32% of students of color right now are unlikely or uncertain about returning to college in the fall, compared to about 1 in 5 white students who are also considering the situation. Among the major issue areas that students are facing beyond just their financial resources, many express a lack of access to internet and or a technological device of some kind. That's about 8 in 10 students who are experiencing that. Many have struggled with adapting to distance or remote learning, and mental health is in the top 3 of the primary concerns that students are facing right now. These stats, by the way, come from a recent survey issued by the National College Attainment Network, NCAN. And on the flip side, for practitioners who are in this space, and many of them who are saying what they wish they could provide more of their students with, they express that they wish that there were more opportunities for automatic FAFSA renewal, things that could keep students on track, having a permanent Pell increase to the Pell Grant for their students of at least $500. Many students are finding it difficult to meet what may be considered a nominal expense by some, but it is actually a very critical expense to many students. TACC, the Texas Association for Community Colleges, recently surveyed their community college students, and about 73% of these students said that they would have either difficulty or find it very difficult to secure a line of credit or $500 in cash to meet an unexpected expense right now following the coronavirus pandemic. In terms of solutions to helping students in need right now, fortunately, we've seen a few bubble to the surface. Many of them have been very creative and innovative. One being Equity, which I mentioned earlier. It's a phone app that partners with institutions and particularly college districts and college systems to ensure that students are able to receive emergency aid quickly. So the institution or institutional system must set aside that emergency aid. Equity is the entity that manages a distribution of it. So with the CARES Act, we're seeing a lot of professional judgment, PJ, that is being allowed to financial aid officers and administrators. Equity then is able to offer this opportunity of distributing aid within 48 hours to students who need it. So the school sets the criteria for which emergency aid will be distributed. Students are then able to use their phone and complete a short questionnaire that, of course, is confidential. It's private. They don't have to show up in person and perform their poverty, as we've seen said. And as soon as they complete that application and complete all their additional personal information that goes into there, they're able to have their application reviewed quickly, and the system is then able to disperse that aid as quickly as possible. So this is a chance for students to have their needs met in a fast and efficient way. Another tool that is complementary to Equity has just been released about 2 weeks ago. It's called Swift Student, and is a faster way to rethink the financial aid appeals process. So as mentioned earlier, we're going to see students who may have to revisit their FAFSAs or whose cost of attendance may have changed because of the fallout of COVID-19. So Student allows for students to, one, become aware that they can actually appeal how much financial aid that they're receiving or eligible to receive, and two, provides templates that allow them to enter in all their critical information and have that sent to a financial aid officer. These templates have already been vetted by organizations such as NAFSA, by focus groups of financial aid officers, by NCAN, and have been generally approved to be one of the most efficient ways to get a student's appeal through the system as quickly as possible without the student having to worry about, oh, did I remember to include all my contact information or my student ID number? We have to remember that in times of crisis, executive functioning for many people shuts down. So having systems that operate quickly and efficiently, require as little thinking, and are as automated as possible really make the difference for many of our students. I'll mention one final example. So here in California, as previously mentioned, Ecmc Foundation dedicated $500,000 in partnership with College Futures Foundation to the Mission Asset Fund to provide an emergency aid fund to California college students who were impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. This fund was launched on April 2nd, and the campaign is still ongoing to continue raising funds for it. But overall, within that first 36 hours, all initial funds were spoken for. And the grants that were being issued to college students who were able to apply during that short window were simple amounts of about $500 each. And now since that portal has closed, about 60,000 students remain on the wait list to receive emergency aid. We're seeing right now that philanthropy can be flexible, philanthropy can be nimble, but philanthropy can also only do so much. And there is a critical need right now more than ever for state and federal intervention in order to make sure our students are wholly supported. I also want to point out that for Mission Asset Fund in particular, the target of this fund were the lowest income students who were either on the brink of experiencing homelessness or already homeless or housing insecure, students who were who had matriculated out of the foster care system or were currently still in touch with the foster care system. Had the eligibility requirements for this fund been broader, the need would still exponentially more substantial. I think on a final note, the challenges that we're seeing our students grapple with, they have intersectional roots. One of the things we can do right now is to be ready with intersectional solutions.
Thanks very much, Angela. Encouraging that there is work happening directly in response to the needs of students, but it certainly sounds like there's a long ways to go. We have a good number of questions coming in. I'm going to hope that our panelists can answer them somewhat briefly so we can get to as many as possible. First one coming in here is for Scott. This person asks, how are you thinking about how to advocate for equity within a skills or talent prioritization in the higher education space? And I assume this is not only how Lumina is thinking about advocacy, but how other partners and stakeholders can think about their advocacy strategies as well.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And our situation on this really hasn't changed because of the pandemic. It's actually become much more urgent. Lumina has an equity imperative. Our state policy agenda is predicated on the equity being the lens by which policy and budgets are made. And as we advocate for that work at this point, that's how we center our conversations around that. That really won't change. And what I've been heartened by in our conversations with state higher education officials and governor staff and others is this the resilience of that equity imperative over the conversation 6 months ago and the conversations now, that still continues of how do we continue these programs that are showing such good success for our students of color, for students with very little social capital, and the types of emergency programs that are being put in place now to support that very student population, and figuring out how to support those institutions that serve those students is much more front and center than I think it would have been had a lot of us not been focused on equity for the last 5 years or so.
Great, thanks, Scott, very helpful. Next question coming in, this is for Caroline, and it comes from Caitlin Vitez. The question is, what teaching and learning challenges do you see coming up if fall semesters are mostly going to be distance learning, particularly around student success and learning outcomes? And second part is, how can your future and current grantees start planning to meet some of those needs?
Yeah, great, thank you. That's a great question. I don't know how many folks may be familiar with Achieving the Dream, a national network focused on community college reform. But they had a terrific town hall in the past week or two with many hundreds of folks. And Karen Stout, the head of that network, said that she was seeing that community colleges that had already been investing in digital learning and pedagogical supports were having a much easier time transitioning to the remote learning environment, which is not surprising. But I do think, colleges that already had built some of that infrastructure, that had strong teaching and learning centers, that had faculty that were already more fluent working in the online space, it makes sense that they're going to be ahead of the curve in terms of that transition. So many questions about what the fall semester is going to look like. And hopefully, if folks haven't checked out Inside Higher Ed's kind of scenario planning series of essays that they've been doing, they're running like 15 different scenarios of what the fall may end up looking like for higher ed, many of which are like unimaginable, but who knows? The world is changing so quickly right now. We'll just have to wait and see. But if colleges are unable to open in person, even though a number of them have already said they are committed to opening in person, but again, who knows? That's many months away. If they are just basically functioning online, will students show up, and which students show up is a big question. And will students be willing to pay for online learning, which has often been, really stigmatized as a lesser form of learning. And unfortunately, I think the experience that many students are getting right now in college with online learning is not giving online learning a fair shake, because practically overnight, colleges had to switch gears, as did K through 12, to go to remote learning. And there's a lot of professors out there who don't know how to operate an iPhone, let alone operate in a fully digital learning environment. And so the disruption and the fits and starts, the unevenness of that experience for many students, hopefully it's getting better and better, and colleges will have the summer to spend more time on figuring out how to make sure teaching and learning is as effective as possible in the fall if it is going to be online. But there's a lot of work to be done to make that feel anywhere close to the value of in-person experiences. I will say too, from community colleges, as we know, community colleges educate most of our first responders in this country, healthcare workers, nurses, police, firemen. They play such a critical role for so many professions, and a lot of those types of programs do not lend themselves well to fully remote learning environments. We probably all don't want our burning house to be saved by a fireman or firewoman who has only taken online classes, right? So I think there's also going to be quite an unevenness in what types of programs are affected or are possible. And especially for low-income students and students of color, as Angela said, many students already saying their plans are changing. It's very possible that it will be more white and more affluent students who are enrolling this fall, thus exacerbating equity gaps in the quality of academic experiences and attainment. So I'm sorry I don't have a clear answer there, but let's hope there's a lot of progress made over the summer so that we can have healthy in-person learning environments, which I know we're all really hoping for this fall.
Thanks, Caroline. Very helpful thoughts. We have another question here from Emily Body. I'm going to ask Angela to respond to this first, but Scott and Caroline, please feel free to chime in. Emily says, I'm wondering if someone could speak to the importance of student civic engagement during this pandemic and how campuses can support service learning, campus community partnerships, and student civic leadership. What can funders do to help support these efforts as well?
So we've been able to see a few bright spots in this space in terms of student civic leadership and engagement. Although it is usually that I would say comes as a component to some of the programs that we fund and not necessarily an area that Ecmc Foundation explicitly supports. So just with that context in mind. But in terms of thinking about how students can be engaged, so here we are all quarantined and we find ourselves in a position where it is more difficult to engage in in-person activities and events. But at the same time, what are the opportunities to step up? So for many of our students who are finding themselves out of work or with summer internships that have now been upended, are there other chances to now be re-engaged and maybe even with the crisis as it's going? So for instance, one organization that comes to mind is Swipe Out Hunger. Swipe Out Hunger was started back in 2012 or 2011 as a very early program for students to use their extra meal swipes and then donate them to students who were food insecure and without swipes for the rest of the semester. And so that became one way of one student's movement of engaging the rest of their campus body. Swipe Out Hunger is now a full-blown organization that engages college students nationally to be able to donate their meal swipes. That is one program that students can still participate in, also with on-campus leadership, in terms of how do we make sure that our other students, our friends who have been either stranded on campus and were fortunate to be able to stay in the dorms because they have nowhere else to go, are still able to have any needs of food insecurity and other basic needs met. I think one thing that was overlooked when allowing students to stay on campus is that many campuses did close their dining halls. And it's not like a dorm necessarily has a kitchen or other means to preserve or cook food. So that is one way to engage, that campus leadership is still even remotely, is still being engaged remotely in order to either liaise with other campus officials or also make sure that food resources stay open for their peers. Another means of student civic engagement and leadership we've seen through organizations such as Rise Education Fund, which is connecting students with other case managers who right now are all volunteer. These include students, these include current student affairs professionals and other higher education administrators and staff who are distributed from all over the country, but are able to take students' emails, questions, calls, and also alleviate some of that caseload that many financial aid administrators are feeling overwhelmed with right now with students who are coping with the crisis. So there are several organizations that are still engaging students and are looking for active student leadership. They're looking to train them, and I think that this is one area that we could actually see a lot of good come out of, especially with peer-to-peer engagement.
Great. Thanks very much, Angela. We have another great question. This one comes from Sean Robertson, and I wonder, it's kind of a broad question. I wonder if we could do a rapid fire response from all three of you, starting with Scott. Sean asks, so many of our organizations are making changes to policies and practices quickly. How do we ensure that we are capturing lessons learned from this new situation? And how do we share these learnings across the higher education ecosystem? Scott, do you want to start this one off?
Sure. That's a really great question, and one that we've been kind of wrestling with at Lumina. We have created through our strategy labs work, which is our work that we do in states, a series of networks made up of higher education leaders, governor's offices, budget offices, things like that, to really kind of capture what people are doing and how they're responding to this, and trying to curate that information and share it among those various networks. But I think the questioner raises a really, really great point, is that how do we do this work in a rapid way so that the information can get out clearly and cogently to the field? And it's something that while we're thinking about doing it in kind of specific, more narrow types of communication channels, the ability to communicate that broadly to the field is something that I think we all need to think about and figure out how we share those ideas that are emerging.
Caroline, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I'm reminded of hearing some historians on TV over the past couple of weeks really encouraging people to journal during this time, which is so like 19th century, but we don't want the history books to just be like Twitter screenshots, right? God forbid. So not that any of us have any extra time on our hands, but taking time to write, engaging on social media, working with membership associations that you're a part of. So there's such a, like, everybody's drinking from the fire hose of content right now, webinars and blogs and membership associations wanting to connect folks and make sure that they're sharing learning throughout the network. There are a lot of vehicles to do that. I think it's just tough to get the bandwidth to do it. One thing I would say is a lot of organizations, unfortunately, have had to cancel their summer internship programs, which is quite devastating. financially, and then also in terms of building social capital for many young people getting started in their careers. We have a new fellow at Kresge who's only been on board for a couple months. She's now in fully remote environment. There are a lot of bright young people that you might be able to bring in or that are already in your orbit that could also be deployed on some of this knowledge gathering and sharing, which is conducive to a digital environment. And I would just say, Angela mentioned earlier a survey by the Texas Association of Community Colleges about what students are facing. They've been great and very productive about sharing that out, especially for those of us that work in very mediated professions, several steps removed from students. When folks do take the time to survey folks on the ground that are being affected and then share that more broadly in ways that help paint a clearer picture for the rest of us, help inform the decisions that we have the privilege to steward around resources, it's so useful to spend some time and energy around sharing what you're learning. So thanks for a thoughtful question and commitment to that.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. Angela, any brief thoughts on this before we go to our final question?
Yeah, very quickly. I want to give a boost to what Caroline said about listening to surveys. Opportunities are coming up to collect voices on the ground, especially of our students. I think one of the things that we don't capture or is really coming to light right now is how much our students were dealing with prior to COVID-19. And so when we're seeing the digital divide, it's a case that's already been exacerbated. For many students, going to campus was their one means of having access to reliable Wi-Fi, or in some cases even access to a digital tool of some kind. And now if they're working from home, they may not have a quiet space to study. They may not have access to reliable Wi-Fi, especially if they have a younger brother or sister who's currently in high school, or someone else in their family who also needs the internet, and that bandwidth is suddenly now spread across 4 or 5 different people. I think we are seeing situations among our students that are exacerbated. So if you already had 17% of college students experiencing homelessness last year and 46% who are housing insecure, that now is coming to the fore. So if there are any opportunities to be able to share what you're hearing on the ground from your constituents, or if you're also able to have access to that information, and right now it's everywhere, so there is no dearth of this right now. I think that is one of the most important steps to being informed about the situation at hand in higher ed and getting more proximal to this issue.
Great. Thank you all so much. In the 6 or so minutes that we have left, I'm going to ask a final question. I'm going to ask our panelists to pull out their crystal balls and look towards the future. Kind of a two-parter. First, I'm wondering if you can talk about kind of the major long-term economic challenges that the higher education sector is going to have to reckon with over the coming years. But I'm also hoping some of you can speak to opportunities that we can think about for reimagining our higher education system in ways that address some of the structural inequalities that persist today. We're going to switch the order a little bit. I'd love if Caroline could respond first, and then we'll go to Scott, and then we'll go to Angela.
Great. Well, I'll be brief. I know we're almost out of time. Unfortunately, it would take way more than 6 minutes to talk about the likely long-term ill economic effects that higher ed is up against right now. But just to mention a few, I mean, this pandemic, as we know, is causing massive disruption at every single level of our economy and our society. And that disruption may be universally felt, but the impacts of it are not going to be equitably distributed. There are very different scenarios for how different types of institutions are going to fare based on whether they have endowments, how much state support they receive, will students show up, et cetera. Especially private, non-selective, high-cost institutions are really imperiled. A lot of concerns about HBCUs and other MSIs right now. There are colleges that will go out of business because of this. So that's quite distressing to contemplate. We may be on a path to really reach a breaking point in terms of college affordability, of what students and families as consumers are willing to pay for college, especially if we're in some type of hybridized education environment for a long time. So we're going to have to wrestle with that. And of course, for most colleges, you've got state support, you've got tuition, you've got some other sources of funding, but there aren't unlimited places to go for dollars. And if enrollment really collapses, that's going to put even more strain on the colleges. I am hopeful, though, that this will open up some new opportunities for collaboration in tight budget environments, focusing on evidence-based practices. We do actually know a lot about what it takes to help students be successful. We don't have dollars to waste to spend time on things that we don't know that work. So really doubling down on what we know will make a difference. Innovation, collaboration, anytime there's huge upheaval like this, hopefully some useful, better models are going to arise from the ashes. And let's hope that those are models that help make higher education more accessible, more fair, lower cost, higher quality to meet the needs of whatever our economy is going to look like emerging from this current mess.
Great. Thanks, Caroline. Scott, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I'll skip Caroline did such a great job of the setup, but I would say that the things that make HBCUs and MSIs so incredibly successful with the students that they serve are the exact reasons why they were more negatively impacted when they had to immediately shift to adding internet access, technology for their student population, and the resources that they will get under this initial tranche of dollars will in no way fulfill where they had to make allocations. And so as we think about this, I'll use the healthcare example. We knew 6 months ago that a global pandemic would have a greater negative impact on our communities of color. We did nothing extraordinary to prepare for that. I'll say it again. We did nothing to prepare for that. We didn't go into the communities, we didn't support, we didn't talk to Black pastors, we didn't do the things we needed to do. We know that the pandemic is going to have a greater negative impact on students of color. Let's not wait 6 months for that to be realized. Let's act now. Unclear what that might look like in the end, but let's start by asking and listening and building policy and practice to support what our communities of color say they need to be successful, to support those students, because we know and they can be on board to help implement that work. Some key barriers that need to be removed, which result in racist outcomes, we know what they are. The articulation and transfer, how we fund our higher education systems within states. Aid policy matters. Data policy matters. The ability to gain broadband connectivity matters. Prior learning assessment, prior learning work that supports students to matriculate through quickly matters. We're going to be, many more students are going to be looking towards quick turnaround type programs where they can gain access to the field. The key thing for that is let's make sure it's equity driven. Let's make sure it supports further education and employment. And as we go through that, let's think of the end in mind. And in 6 months, we will have a much more affirmation of what we did to serve the students that is today's student.
Great. Very important call to action. Thank you, Scott. Angela, turning it over to you for a brief final word.
So Scott kind of brought the house down. I'm just going to say that. But so I guess to add on to that, as the millennial in the room here who's now experienced 2 major recessions within 10 years, I do want to highlight that how can we turn to the 2008 recession and look at lessons learned from there? Because we know that from the 2008 recession, the individuals who were able to weather that recession and come out on top were those who had a post-secondary degree of some kind. And those who were left behind were individuals who did not. Also at this time, we saw that many states slashed higher education budgets. And we know that higher ed budgets aren't necessarily constitutionally protected in every state. And so it's oftentimes one of the first things to go on the chopping block. And in some cases, we've also seen that higher ed budgets have not recovered to pre-2008 recession levels. So what does this mean in terms of being able to protect these opportunities and these pathways, also with a sense toward equity? One of the things that, to echo what Scott said, I really think there should be a prioritization of who our neediest students are, of who our students who have been historically locked out of higher education are. Students of color, first-generation students, students who are low income. We often hear the phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats. The problem is that some of these boats are cruise ships, and then some of them are life rafts. And the cruise ships will be fine. The thing that we have to think about are those who do not have access to reliable internet, who do not have the same levels of engagement or opportunity or resources that so many of our more privileged students have access to. I do also want to go back and underscore the note about paying attention to our minority serving institutions, especially the MSIs in each of our states. MSIs are 23% of all institutions in higher education nationally, and they disproportionately enroll 50% of all undergraduates of color. They enroll 40% of all Pell eligible students, and they enroll 30% of all undergraduates nationally. So if you were to just even focus on your MSIs, that is already a significant proportion of students who are being served, and especially those who have the most to gain from a college degree. Final plug would be to say that now is a time to really be thinking about what our plans and strategies are for returning learners or individuals who have some college credit but no degree. Because if we're expecting right now a lot of students to be stopping out, then there has to be something in place to make sure that we can re-engage them and encourage them to finish. If there are any set of recommendations that I would strongly encourage state policymakers, legislatures to really consider, would be also to decouple state financial aid eligibility from federal aid, to think about how to temporarily revise or suspend any credit completion or GPA requirements for renewal of state scholarships. Think about what are the fastest ways that students can have access to aid to make sure that their education continues uninterrupted or as uninterrupted as possible. And then what can also be done on that note to provide additional aid to institutions who are directly serving students who are going through this.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Angela. This has been a terrific conversation. I know here at the Hunt Institute, we have plenty to chew on, and I'd imagine the folks who spent their morning with us do as well. Really want to thank our three fantastic panelists. And before we conclude, I just want to share some additional conversations that the Hunt Institute is going to be hosting with policymakers that we would love for you to consider joining. We have 3 upcoming webinars that are going to feature state chiefs who will be comparing notes and sharing best practices. May 5th, we'll be hearing from state chiefs from North Dakota, Wyoming, and Idaho. On May 12th, we'll be hearing from state chiefs from Florida, Tennessee, and Texas. And then on May 21st, we'll have an event with the state chiefs from Missouri, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Last note from me is that at the Hunt Institute, we have a COVID-19 landing page. It's got a lot of helpful resources to inform policymaker responses. It's something that we update constantly. In fact, this morning we just posted a new brief about financial challenges in the higher education space, some of which you heard about today. So I would certainly encourage you all to visit that page. That's it for us. We appreciate you joining us today. Thanks again to the panelists. And we hope to see you again soon at the intersection.